is always a blessing.
I'm just thankful you had the opportunity to go to Kelsey.
That was a blessing as well.
Yeah.
Yep. So I came with some notes this morning, which I usually don't have a pile of notes. The history behind it was that prophetically, this is an interesting week. This past week and the week ahead of us, no less. And because it was snowy last week, every time I go to step outside, it'd be snowing again, and mushy and messy, and never amounted to much other than just a bunch of mess. And so I sat and biblically researched a number of questions that have been on the edge of my mind with regard to what's happening. The events on stage right now are different in a unique way than they've ever been since church began. And that being that what we refer to as the signs, we're not given specific signs as to the timing of the rapture. We're given specific signs with regard to the tribulation period. All the discourse gives signs with regard to that. The Old Testament prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, they all give signs with regard to that. They call it the day of the Lord. But because we will be raptured immediately before that, there's an overlap where as we see these things lining up, in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, he says that we're to be awake, understanding that this is the season of the Lord's return. So let's turn there, very familiar portion, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night, when they shall say peace and safety. And that was said this week. Then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in the darkness, that the day should overtake you as a thief. Verse 6, therefore let us watch. The believer is not told exactly when the rapture will be, but we are told the events that will be transpiring as the tribulation is ready to explode before us, and that is a wake-up call. We're not to be asleep, we're to understand it is the season of the Lord's return for the believer. This past week, Steve Whitman, the envoy, special envoy through President Trump to the Middle East, had some very interesting comments, especially with regard to Iran. The president gave the Iran the ultimatum that they would never be allowed to reach the point of enriched uranium, which is 65%, isn't it, Chris?
I don't remember.
I think it's 65% enrichment. And Wickoff said this week that they will be reaching that within this next week. And the administration said they will not allow it to happen. Go ahead.
I thought their nuclear program was obliterated. What happened?
You thought it was already obliterated?
I thought we took care of it.
No. It was back in April when they attacked upon Iran by Israel and the US. We assumed we'd knock much of it out, only to find out that later a significant portion of it survived. And so they've been continuing on the enrichment program. And they, according to Wickoff, he's the one who would be in the know, that they're going to reach that point this week. If you've been following over the last few years, they've been saying within 2 years we'll reach that point. And then within the last year, it's been down to within months we'll reach that point. And then because of April, they were right on that point. We set them back a little bit. But now they're within a week of it. And so the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln has been parked in the Gulf for what, a month now, and the Gerald Ford entered the Mediterranean 2 or 3 days ago and is now off the west coast of Israel. And so on that front and a number of others, there's a lot to watch. And there's never been a time in history, we mentioned this a couple times recently, there's never been a time in history when so many of the signs, what we refer to as signs of his coming, with regard to largely to the event of the tribulation, we've never had a time in history when so many of them are all of a sudden all with a heads up. We've had them and there's been half a dozen of them that way. Right now, about 25 of the major signs that Bible teachers have talked about the last few decades, beginning with the establishment of the nation Israel, that's kind of the starting point, the end of the time of the Gentiles. Never has there been a time in history when almost all of them are red flagged. And so I want us to turn back to Genesis just a moment. We're going to look at a few of these. Genesis chapter 49. Did you hear the words of Huckabee? I didn't hear them, I read them. Mike Huckabee informed, educated Tucker on actually what ground in real estate Israel does on. Did anybody hear that? It's worth a read online. He was entirely biblical, and so much so that he named that Israel, according to Genesis, owns the land from the Mediterranean Sea to the Gulf, the river in the south. And that took Carlson off his chair. And Huckabee later said, now all Israel is asking for right now is the land she possesses. And you're not even giving her that. He's anti-Semitic. That is Tucker Carlson. And very good statement, but again, very timely as well. So in Genesis 49, there's something geographically we need to understand. The nation Israel, from the hiccup here on the coast of Israel to about halfway down between that and the area of Egypt, there's a large swath of the coastland that is part of the tribe of Manasseh. You remember when Joseph, 2 sons inherited what would have been his possession, Manasseh and Ephraim. They refer to those oftentimes as half-tribes. But the inheritance of Manasseh is the largest inheritance of all the tribes. Part of it is, again, west of the Nile, and part of it is over here, east of the Nile. Ephraim is below Manasseh down here. But,
You mean the Jordan?
pardon?
You mean the Jordan? Jordan River?
Yep.
You said Nile. So
I said, what?
you said the Nile River.
Just now?
I'm confused. You said the Nile River. I'm wondering, did you mean the Jordan River?
I mean the Jordan River now.
Okay.
Were you referring to when I was talking about Mike Huckabee's comments? I did mean the Nile with,
No, just now.
wait,
You just now said Nile.
yeah,
You
okay.
meant to say the Jordan.
I thought I was
Okay.
hearing it wrong. I thought, well, wait a minute, no, everybody else heard it too.
Okay,
Yeah,
He was just clarifying.
yeah.
I often say things I think one thing and say another.
If you're thinking of 10 different things at once, that can happen.
It can happen when I'm thinking of one thing at once. So the tribe location, keep that in your head as we read here in Genesis chapter 49. In verse 1, and Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. That's the first time this phrase, statement, the last days, occurs in Scripture. From that point onward through the Old Testament and the New, either in that statement, the last days, or sometimes called end times, sometimes called the end in the book of Daniel. That statement becomes very prevalent through the Old Testament, speaking of a specific period of time. And that would be again from the establishment of the nation Israel at the end of the time of the Gentiles on through the tribulational period, which then would mark a time, a season when Jesus is coming back for his church as well, what we refer to as the rapture. And so Jacob gathered his sons together before he died, and to the 12 of them, he gave a prophetic utterance. But the prophetic utterance wasn't just random, it would apply to what period in history? Pardon? The last days. Could that possibly be the time in history you're living, Jeremy? It is. So we're not going to go through all of these, but we want to go up to Joseph. And we read of the prophecy made to him, beginning in verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty who shall bless thee, with blessings of heaven above. Now notice the next statement. Blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of the breast and of the womb. So this prophecy with regard to the last days includes the statement, blessings of the deep. The word blessings there is the Hebrew word for a gift or a present. God has a gift or a present for the descendants of Joseph, Ephraim, that we find will spread to the nation at large. And it's in the deep. Several times in the Old Testament, you'll find that word deep used with regard to the ocean. It's the Hebrew word that just means an ocean or a sea, a huge body of water. And so God has something, a present or a gift in the deep. And continues by saying that lieth under. And that phrase lieth under is the word couched or in the bosom of, speaking of the earth beneath. So literally, God has a blessing or a present or a treasure for Joseph and his descendants under the ocean, couched in the deep, under the deep, beneath the earth. And as you're aware, quite recently, out here they discovered what they call Leviathan. And now they got a whole maze of natural gas wells, one of the largest supplies of natural gas on the face of the earth. And within the last weeks, Israel has entered into agreement with Egypt and with Jordan, and negotiations are in place with others where they're selling fuel. And a large part of the monies that Israel is using to build up its arms, military, is coming from that, which they didn't know about. It was hidden down there until a strategic time when it was needed, which happens to be the last days, Jeremy. What a surprise. That's just not happenstance. God put that there for a special time in history when Israel would need it. So I had jotted down as I was sitting down, I think it was Wednesday morning, studying, I jotted down about 20-25 clear statements that are made in scripture with regard to, we call them signs, that this is imminently on the threshold before us, before the world, the rapture before us. And again, in the past, as I worked through these, maybe 6 of them are pointing up, red flag. Right now, every single one of them is red flagging. We've talked about recently Jeremiah 49, and something's going to happen very quickly in Iran. The revolt continues there, and again, the president has said he's not going to allow them to reach full enrichment to bomb grade. And he gave them 3 or 4 days ago, he gave them 10 to 15 days, was it? To make a decision. And if they hadn't made a decision at that point to get rid of it, then the US would immediately step in. So Jeremiah 49, I believe, has the flag sticking up. The rise of wickedness. Let's go to 2 Timothy chapter 3. Wickedness has always been around. But even the 2 Timothy chapter 3, the unsaved world is shocked at what's coming out with regard to Epstein. 2 Timothy chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, trans, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. And it goes on. But if you take and put this passage of scripture right next to, I did it with Fox News. Take Fox News for the day, put it down in the column. And take the scripture and put it down in the column. Start drawing the lines across. And it's enlightening. The Clintons were called in to give their excuses. And Andrew, is that the nobility over there? King George and all of that, I'm not into that kind of stuff. In fact, I think it's funny in one sense and tragic in another. But the filth, the rise of wickedness, the mass shootings. The particular day I was making the comparison, that particular day, there were at least 2 major shootings in the US. Strong delusion. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2.
Pastor, it's worth mentioning that the vast majority of those shootings appear to be related to the trends.
It's related to the evil, the wickedness of it, yeah, more wickedness. But they're not talking about what you just said is not a politically correct statement. But it's absolutely correct. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 11. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe a lie. Delusional. A number of things that climate change, that's delusional. There's a turn in the climate. There's unusual things happening climate-wise all over. But that's not because of climate change. It's because of the olive discourse. And Jesus said that is the very sign of the time in which we find ourselves here. But delusional ideas concerning climate, delusional ideas concerning gender. Again, the day I was making comparison, Hillary Clinton had a dialogue with a European leader, and he was mocking the fact that she didn't understand the genders, of which he said there are two. Of course, he's absolutely correct.
The best one was did you see when they went to that tribe in Africa and were trying to explain to the men that over in the West, men could be women, and they would just be followed and laughing like they never heard such a thing.
It is delusional. We've had young people in college in our own congregation here recently who have had to suffer the penalty of getting zeros and F's on their work because they believe in two genders.
When I was, in high school, I would have mocked them like that tribe that he's talking about. And this idea of marrying two men marrying each other. Are you kidding me? Why don't you marry your puppy dog? Well, now that happens too, apparently. It's just outrageous. It's over the top.
The problem is though that what bothers this delusion is around us, like we're pointing out here. And okay, but the problem is that we're allowing these people in the positions of authority to run society. That's the problem.
And churches, they're in churches.
And especially in a field like your interest in the area of physics, a physicist will understand that there are certain laws by which they have to operate, otherwise it doesn't work. But then he has to live as though there's no laws. But in order for his occupation to work, he has to honor certain laws. And it's delusional.
And they've ruled out the option of compassion. You cannot be compassionate to these people in the true sense of the word, to where we can help them. No, that's bigoted. Trying to help them is bigoted. That's heartbreaking. Because as we're seeing now, a lot of people are seeing the light and they say, wow, I messed up my life. And I made bad decisions, especially when they're young, right? I think we understand that if an older person wants to make bad decisions, that's their choice. But it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking what some of these people will have to go through now. These beautiful young ladies have mutilated themselves. And,
When those young people needed protection,
yes.
instead they were led by delusional individuals. So delusion's always been around, but never has it been to where it is the accepted norm, which it is currently. Turn to 2 Peter chapter 3. the mockers increased according to 2 Peter chapter 3 in the last days. Verse 3, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, that's the Greek word mockers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they are willingly ignorant. And he speaks about the flood. Now, what's striking here is that the mockers who are denying a literal rapture and a literal interpretation of Scripture, that's largely not coming from the unsaved clientele out there, but it's coming from the evangelical church. The evangelical church, 50 years ago, the largest element of it believed in the rapture because to some degree or another they held to what we call dispensationalism, at least to the point of seeing a distinction between Israel and the church, a distinction between law and grace. But currently, we are on the minority side of scriptural truth concerning the rapture, the scriptural truth concerning a period in history, the 7-year tribulation period, the scriptural truth concerning the literal 1,000-year millennium. And today, our group is continuing to shrink, Chris, and what is growing, dominion theology is growing like wildfire. Dominion theology teaches that we're improving as a society, we're improving as a church, and we're making such an impact, the world is getting better and better and better. And there's going to come a day very soon, George, when the world is going to be so perfect that we've set sin aside, and Jesus is going to look down and say, wow, it's time for me to come and claim my kingdom. How's that working out, Jeremy?
That always amazes me that they because almost exclusively, you can go prior to 1880, almost exclusively the church believed in the rapture. Like you really have to find people that didn't believe in the rapture. And then they totally, there's that shift where we're going to make the church correct for God so that he can come back. And they really believe that. I don't know how many people living today believe that, but in like 1920, it's totally preached. That we have to prepare the world for God to come back. And Pentecostals don't understand that even today. They don't know any of that.
It's on the grow. And then with Calvinism, what's on the grow is replacement theology, where Israel has been replaced by the church. And they move to the extreme that they don't believe that Israel should even exist.
Do they want to replace Israel during the tribulation?
Good point. Go ahead.
The root cause of this stuff, all this stuff, is that people don't read the Bibles for what it is. It's the word of God. You don't throw any of it out.
A lot of these people are using modern Bibles.
Now, you can get a lot of junk Bible anyway. And I don't think that's the right Bible to have, but some of the stuff he's talking about, you still don't have an excuse even if you're reading it out of the Bible.
So there's
a correlation.
there's the all-mill view, there's the post-mill view, and there's a number of other views. But again, there's the replacement theology view, which is growing. So that now evangelicalism as a whole no longer supports Israel. But it's this minority within evangelicalism that holds to the separation, the distinction between Israel and the church, that takes the stance that David Marcus called a Zionist, takes the stance that,
Watch out.
Your glasses fell.
take the stance, thank you, take the stance that Israel ought to be there. And so I appreciate Mike Huckabee still holding on to that. But most of the mocking concerning the pre-tribulational rapture, concerning the literal interpretation of the scriptures with regard to prophecy, most of the mocking is not coming from the unsaved world. The unsaved world actually is quite distressed with the events happening around us. But the evangelical church, the religious element that ought to know better, rather than being distressed with what's happening, looks at it and mocks us for holding to the truth. So as Peter says here, there will be scorning or mocking. And then what we began with, we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Let's go there. Again, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Verse 3, for when they shall say peace and safety, sudden destruction shall come. Now, our president, I believe, has good heart and good intent with regard to this Board of Peace. I don't believe he is seeking to usher in the false covenant of the Antichrist. But turn now to the book of Daniel, chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. And that's the account of the 70 weeks there, 490 years upon Israel. 483 which have already been accomplished at the time of the crucifixion. And now this last week, the tribulation period is what remains. And so picking up the account here in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with the flood, unto the end of the wars of desolations are determined. So what's spoken of here is the crucifixion of Christ, and then the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And then the clock stops. It's stopped now for nearly more than 2,000 years. Or nearly 2,000 years. What happens next when it starts is we're raptured and the tribulation begins in the last 7 years of the 490 years determined upon Israel will happen. Now, verse 27, and he that's speaking of the Antichrist shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And so the Antichrist, we can read of this elsewhere as well. The Antichrist, like in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where it says that there will be this cry, peace and safety at last. Boom, the tribulation will begin. And the Antichrist is going to confirm a covenant with many. And so I believe that the Board of Peace may well be that many. Again, our president is not the Antichrist. I don't believe. But the many are ones who will work with him, I think, possibly, when the tribulation opens up. Now, more than an interest in those who were named in the Board of Peace, to me, was an interest in those who were not. With the exception of Turkey, the nations that stand on each side of this Board of Peace, those that are in and those that are out. The nations that Ezekiel 38 speaks of, Magog, Persia, Iran, Ethiopia, others listed there. those nations are out. And then the nations of Europe and nations that are in are distinctly on the other side of this Ezekiel 38 point, other than Turkey. And so it was of interest to me that it may well be that the events that are needed for Ezekiel 38 that we wondered how are those going to be fulfilled, the peace and safety part of it, that this board of peace will probably guarantee a temporary peace for Israel, probably to the extent, I believe, of even allowing them to build a temple. And as found here, required here in the book of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. But then there's going to be Ezekiel 38 and Israel attacked. Now, interestingly, Iran has to be intact for that to happen because Iran joins with Israel after Jeremiah 49 takes place. Then that corrupt leadership of Iran is out, and the people who are seeking after God are in. So you wonder, how would that work with Ezekiel 38? And so that's why, again, the red flags went up this week in my mind because, wow, if this is the finalizing of all of these things, it's going to happen quick. It could well happen in the next few weeks or a few months, because if Iran has to be intact for it to happen, but Iran's leadership has to be intact for it to happen, Ezekiel 38, then with events that are forecasted for Iran in the immediate future, I think maybe we're possibly on the threshold. I'm watching the clock back there. Other things I had on this list was looking for a world leader, the building of the third temple, the beast technology, the AI and the robotic, Revelation chapter 13, other places with regard to that as well. With AI, we're increasing in knowledge. I read that every 2 weeks, Chris, there's a doubling of knowledge. Whereas when my grandfather lived, every 100 years, every century, there was a doubling of knowledge. And then in my lifetime, when I was in college, they would say that maybe every 25 years, there's a doubling of knowledge. Currently with AI, every 2 weeks, there's a doubling of knowledge. Which brings to life the last chapter of Daniel, where it talks about an increase in knowledge. And then at that point, it says those who let's go there real quickly. We'll know, we're in Daniel chapter 9, we just need to go over to chapter 12. He shares in chapter 12 and verse 4 with regard to this increase in knowledge. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And then Daniel is told to seal up the book in verse 9. But notice verse 10, many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So this was Daniel wrote in his day was not understandable. But then, as knowledge increases, then there will come a point in history when those who are wise, speaking of believers with their eyes open, he says will understand. And so again, going back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, I think we are in a position where we need to have our eyes open and understand that we're living in a season here when these things are rapidly being fulfilled. Other things that I listed was the alignment of Middle East nations, which have never been lined up biblically like they are currently. The no borders globalism, apostasy, doctrines of demons, 1 Timothy chapter 4 verse 1, with false prophets and other things that Jesus spoke of in the Olivet Discourse. Right now, if you've been following online, there's just been a huge exposure of false prophets coming out of Daystar, coming out of Reading there with Bethel, and worldwide. Benny Hinn's fighting for his life. And all that's false prophecy. And that's the day in which we live. Persecution of Christians and Jews. Talk to those in Iran about that. Worldwide disasters. And then, as I had mentioned, striking is the fact that not only are there more of these with the flag up right now than there's ever been in the history of the church, but the fact that it's all happening at the same time. It's like a converging of them. And so, Jeremiah 49 is yet to be fulfilled. Ezekiel 38 is yet to be fulfilled. Psalm 83 is yet to be fulfilled. But the alignment of the nations currently appear to be that fulfillment is imminent. The U.S. is going, and Israel are going to deal with Iran. That appears to be, maybe it happened in Jeremiah 49. The board of peace dealing with Gaza, which answers to Zephaniah chapter 2 and Ezekiel chapter 25. And the board of peace could be answering to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, and the list goes on. And never in my lifetime has this been the case, with them all pointing that direction. Chris, you dismiss this.
We got New Year's Day, it's things that we can have hope, and we're not stuck here. As it all collapses, and just thank you for your word. We ask your blessings on Israel. We ask your blessings on believers far and wide that are going through difficult times, Lord, being persecuted. Ask for wisdom in these last days. How we should spend our time. And just ask your blessing on the